So one of the big situations I've noticed that seems to come up when you're a creationist and you're debating evolution is that somebody will ask you, well, how can creationists explain X, Y, and Z? And X, Y, and Z might be, for example, something about genetics, and you're like, well, actually, here's a great article on this exact topic by a PhD geneticist. The article was published in the Answers magazine from the Answers in Genesis organization. And the person will say, oh, whoa, that's a creationist source. I can't accept that. Well, obviously this is a fallacy, because they're like, well, if creation's true, then you would expect evolutionists to affirm it. Which, of course, is total nonsense. That's like saying, well, if communism is true, then you will expect capitalists to affirm it, or vice versa. I mean, it's total nonsense, but a lot of people will say, legitimately, will ask, well, how do I know that I can trust creationist sources? And I'm here today to answer that question in this video. One thing that I think that people haven't really realized is that it's not about the evidence directly. It's about the interpretation of the evidence. Generally speaking, creationists and evolutionists agree on what the scientific evidence is, but they will disagree with how to interpret it. For example, you might find I've talked about similarities between different species before, how that can be the result of a common ancestor, convergence, or it can be the result of a common designer. So human beings and mice, for example, have very similar eyes, and the reason is because we have a common designer who created that eye. Similar to the way that software engineers will have a lot of similarities between different programs that they develop that have to perform similar processes. And same with architects. Bridge designers will develop similar bridges. And so, it's like I said, it's not necessarily directly about the evidence, but people seem to forget that it's about what was the validity of the argument. Very often evolutionists will assume, well, if you're a creationist, you must be lying. And that's really not a sound argument. For example, if you go and get an article from the Answers in Genesis website, there's citation at the bottom of the article. You know who wrote it because it'll say X, Y, and Z by Dr. So-and-so, and then you can find out what their credentials are. PhD in biochemistry from Cambridge University. And you can go and find out, did this person actually get their PhD in biochemistry from Cambridge University? You can look at the citation at the bottom of the article, be like, okay, Nature, this particular quote is from Nature News on cherry trees, 2011. So you go look up that particular article in Nature News about cherry trees from 2011, you find out, did they quote it accurately? It seems like people have forgotten I mean, this happens, but my major answer to that question is look up the citation. When I actually was very young and I was starting to learn about creation versus evolution, I had one person who was an evolutionist tell me, well, you can't trust Answers in Genesis, they're a bunch of liars. And, he was saying, well, they misrepresent the facts. And I said, well, can you give me some examples of some facts that they're misrepresenting? Oh, well, they say that evolution isn't true and evolution's a fact. And they say that the Earth is young, but that's a fact that it's not true. That's a fact that it's old. And I was like, wait a minute. I didn't know the term at the time, but, that's begging the question. Those are the very things that they're debating. And they acknowledge that the mainstream scientific community thinks that evolution is true, thinks it's well established. They acknowledge that the mainstream scientific community, by and large, thinks that the Earth is old. But these are the very points that they're trying to debate. They're trying to say, no, we don't think the evidence supports this conclusion. And in reality, these really, the grand claims about evolution and the grand claims about the age of the Earth, at the end of the day, they're not really facts, they're inferences. So they're not something you directly observe. You don't directly observe and a microbe going to a human. However strong your evidence, somebody might think that their evidence is, it's not something that's directly observed. It's not like gravity. However strong you think the evidence is, the idea that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old isn't a fact because we don't have a time machine. We have different dating methods that people infer that they think that the Earth is so old. And I can talk about that more in I've talked about these sorts of things more in other videos. But bottom line is, it's not valid to say, oh well, that person's a creationist, they must be lying. There's citation at the bottom of the page. Go check out the citation. And actually, I have done this quite a few times. For example, with the National Center for Science Education, they had a response to a book by Jonathan Wells entitled, Jonathan Wells is an embryologist, and he wrote a book called Icons of Evolution, Why Much of What We Teach About Evolution is Not True. And so Jonathan Wells is a critic of Darwinian evolution. He's more in the intelligent design movement. And he's a PhD scientist, and he really knows what he's talking about. So he talked about Haeckel's embryos. So there were these false embryo drawings that were in high school biology textbooks. Now, you have to understand, these drawings weren't real. They were a hoax from the 1800s, specifically from the 1860s. And they were still in the biology textbooks circa, around the year 2000-ish when this was published. And he cited the different textbooks and said, X, Y, and Z textbook has Haeckel's embryos in them. Now, the National Center for Science Education came back and said, no, Jonathan Wells is lying. These textbooks do not have Haeckel's embryos in them. That's a pretty simple matter to verify one way or the other. So what I did was, and I did this on video, by the way, for the whole world to see, I went and ordered these textbooks, opened them up to the page that supposedly had Haeckel's embryos, and lo and behold, they were right there. So in this case, the guy arguing for intelligent design was telling the truth, and the National Center for Science Education was lying. So anyway, so that's my 2 cents pretty much about, well, how do you know the creationists are telling the truth? Well, you don't have to take anybody's word for anything. Go look up the citation. Look at their logic. Does their logic pan out? Does their citation pan out? In the case of National Center for Science Education, I mean, I think it's pretty clear. The most obvious and the most straightforward explanation for what was happening is that the National Center for Science Education was intentionally lying, whereas Jonathan Wells was telling the truth. Because, I didn't pull out my crayons and draw Haeckel's embryos into the textbooks on camera. So anyway, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Subscribe, comment, rate. Check out my other videos. And check out my websites, greenslug.com, which is my blog, and blueslug.com, the science search engine I've been developing. And remember, in both cases, slug is spelled with 2 G's. This is Greg, and I hope may God bless you. May God bless all of your families. This is Greg, out.